Hey everybody, Fred Minnick here, and in this video I'm going to talk about President Taft and why I believe he is the greatest president in bourbon history. Now, I know what you're thinking. President Taft, isn't that the guy that got stuck in a bathtub? Well, just so you know, some people say that is not true. So that has been refuted just enough to suggest that maybe that was his political opponents saying that he got stuck in a bathtub. But we can say that he was a large man. That said, he probably would be normal by today's standards. Okay, so President Taft, why is he in there? I think it's also important to point out there are some other presidents that could be up for the running. Let me dispute those real quick or kind of talk about those real quick, and then I'll tell you why they're not in there. So President Washington was a distiller. He was a big rye whiskey distiller, but he imposed the whiskey tax, right? He imposed the whiskey tax, and distillers did not like that very much. So if he becomes the greatest American whiskey president in history, we might be having some zombie distillers from Pennsylvania rise up and come shank us. So let's stay away from naming President Washington as the greatest whiskey president of all time. Now, if we said this is the greatest whiskey distiller of all time, you know what? I would say that it probably is President Washington. Although Abraham Lincoln's dad did work for a distiller, so I've always wondered, did he pick up any tricks while he was at those Kentucky distillers back in the day? President Jefferson is probably the closest person, in my opinion, that could come to President Taft. Thomas Jefferson repealed the whiskey tax in 1802. By the way, that was a very unpopular thing to do. This was one of our country's very first arguments against rich people getting a tax cut. The tea importers and molasses importers of New England, specifically Rhode Island, were very much questioning the president's authority to repeal the whiskey tax because it was placating to the rich. And the distillers, they absolutely loved it because, what happens when you have a business that's 100% federally tax-free? You put that money somewhere else. And that was huge for the distillers. But the thing that might have been bigger was that President Jefferson pursued the Louisiana Purchase. And when that gets signed and basically Louisiana is opened up tariff-free, they don't have to pay a duty to the French or the Spaniards every time they take their flatboats down to Louisiana. They have access to New Orleans without having to pay to get in there. And so at that time, you're looking at New Orleans. By the way, people in New Orleans drink a lot then, they drink a lot today. That place, they're just always drinking. And, I got a lot of New Orleans stories, by the way. I don't think I can share them in public, but drink a lot. So they were drinking a lot of Jamaican rum, and they were drinking a lot of French brandy. So those were the two primary things that they were drinking. But as Kentucky began to get its whiskey into New Orleans at a higher volume, that started to supplant some of those foreign brands. So President Jefferson really could be given this throne. He's the only person, I believe, that has an argument to be had for them to be the greatest president in whiskey history, American whiskey history anyway. You could say Grover Cleveland because Grover Cleveland signed the Bottled Bond Act, but he just, it wasn't enough there. You could say President Grant if you were talking about the greatest drinking president of all time. President Grant was a well-known Old Crow fan. In fact, during the Civil War, President Lincoln requested to find out what he was drinking so he could give it to his other generals. That's a true story. That man liked his bourbon. So President Grant's probably the biggest bourbon fan of all time. Now, when you get into, the more modern era, JFK was not around to see this, but JFK had this effort to improve exports when he became president, and bourbon becoming a unique product of the United States, which happened in 1964. That kind of comes in underneath that export initiative from JFK. So JFK is like a distant, like if you're really tied to that unique declaration of being a unique product of the United States, if you're really tied to that, then I would say JFK could have an outside shot of being the greatest president in whiskey history. Now, there's certainly other presidents have had an impact. President Obama, did a trade deal with Brazil, and helped our exports into Brazil. But if you look at Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, pursued to deregulate the alcohol industry and essentially got rid of so much government bureaucracy within the distilleries. A lot of times the distillers wanted to keep that, but still, these are all small potatoes in comparison to what President Taft did. President Taft comes into office, and there are some major issues happening with whiskey. Well, I don't think I can fully tell this story without going to the 1870s. In the 1870s, the business of whiskey making was essentially the distillers made the whiskey, put it in the barrel, sold it to a wholesaler or a rectifier, and then they would do stuff to it. Now, what was called straight whiskey would be like that whiskey wasn't jacked around with, it wasn't stolen, it hadn't been cut with anything. It was, for a lack of better term, it was pure whiskey. And the doctors would begin to buy this rectified stuff that was cut with something like prune juice, and they were noticing that their people were not getting well, and they would blame the whiskey's efficacy for not making their patients better. And so the doctors, the druggists, and the distillers are kind of getting together, figuring out what they can do. And one of the solutions becomes like, let's make sure we can bottle at the distillery, which that began to become a practice. Old Forester is known for having in its marketing that they were a bottled bourbon before anybody else. There were other distilleries who were bottling their bourbon around that same time, but they are, of the existing brands, they are the oldest, tenured one that's been bottling by the same company essentially the entire time since 1870. And you get into this war between these blenders and these straight distillers, and people ask all the time, like, why is blending a dirty word in American whiskey? Why are people so against, like the old timers, so against the word blend on American whiskey label? This is the origin of it. This is where it all comes from, this 1870s battle between the straight whiskey distillers and the blenders. And they were basically fighting over territory with consumers. And this would go on for 20 years. 20 years this was happening. And finally, the distillers were growing in numbers, so there was more support coming around on the distillery side. And so they passed the Bottled and Bond Act. And the Bottled and Bond Act, which becomes our, country's first, or one of the first, consumer protection legislation acts, basically still stands today. And in fact, you can find it on bottles today, like this Old Forester 1897. So Grover Cleveland signs this act in 1897. And that is thought to be a big win for the distilleries. By the way, in my description, I've got a full story on the Bottle and Bond Act and some bottles that you can buy. But I want to get to President Taft as quick as I can here, but before leading up to it too much. But Bottle and Bond Act was so important, but there was a lot. It basically gave distillers a government guarantee. So it gave distillers a government guarantee and consumers a government guarantee that the whiskey was, and it could have been anything, but it was usually whiskey, that the whiskey was at least 4 years old, distilled at one distillery in one distilling season, and bottled at 100 proof. Now, that it's changed a little bit over the years in terms of what is needed on the bottle, but this in 1897 was very, very important. Now, after this time frame, The blenders were like, well, you know what? Uh, you guys can have this bottled and bond designation. We're still going to do our thing. And so they began to really focus on the medicinal market. And by focusing on the medicinal market, there were some people who were making claims. They were making a lot of false claims. They were making claims like, if you drink our whiskey, you'll live to be 162 years old. If you drink our whiskey, you'll cure cancer, or your gout will be cured. There's really a couple of them, most notoriously Duffy's Pure Malt Whiskey, that was a part of this. Now, President Teddy Roosevelt gets into office, and he sees these false medicinal claims. There are all of these. Doctors who are beginning to boycott any medical journal that has an advertisement from Duffy's Pure Malt Whiskey. And President Roosevelt sees this as a significant issue for the American consumer. Meanwhile, people are dying from bad vaccines. People are dying from preservatives, like bad preservatives. Like you have children and soldiers. Soldiers, we've been given everything. We get the soldier community, which, raising my hand here, that was me. Go USO, helping the soldiers. Marines, Airmen, Navy, Coast Guard, everybody. USO is awesome. But you have, I was given several doses of anthrax, and it wasn't even FDA approved. In fact, they lost my medical records, and they had to redo my anthrax. So I've been jabbed so many times by the military that Anyway, I'm getting off subject. When I get off of my military tangents, I can go off in a while. And where was I? Okay, so in this time frame, President Roosevelt was very concerned for the American population in terms of medicine, like healthcare wise, and so he began to initiate efforts to basically solve that. And he commissioned Dr. Wiley. Now he's got, this Dr. Wiley fellow becomes famous in later years, but right here in this moment, he was a guy that he was researching this. It would be something like he was trying to figure out how to solve this. And the most important thing to come out of that was definitely, getting rid of the bad preservatives. Like, let's maybe not put sulfuric acid with keeping our hamburger meat. Getting rid of bad vaccines. And I don't remember exactly what they pulled out of it, but they got rid of a lot of ingredients that were killing people. But all anyone talked about, all that was in the newspapers that was really leading the headlines, was how whiskey was effective. And this still holds true today, that distillers cannot make medicinal claims unless there is like a third independent party study connected to it. And also there's things like you can't have pure on a label unless it's within a trademark. So you can't call your bourbon pure bourbon. You got pure Kentucky, but that's a trademark. You can't use it in fanciful terminology on a label. And it all goes back to trying to block false medicinal claims from this guy, Duffy's Pure Malt Whiskey. Now, this is the time that President Taft comes aboard. By the way, that was a Pure Food and Drug Act, and that's the precursor to the FDA. So I want you to think about that for a second, how important American whiskey is to the United States of America's history. You have a president imposing a whiskey tax. You have a president repealing a whiskey tax. You have a president signing into law one of the first consumer protection legislation acts in the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. You have the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is the precursor to the FDA, basically being created to stop idiots from improperly marketing whiskey. So think about that for a second. Those are things I feel like should be taught in history at both high school and college. In terms of President Taft, so President Taft gets into office, and there is all kinds of confusion about what the Pure Food and Drug Act had just done. And you still have this trade war between these straight whiskey distillers and these blenders. and they're going back and forth over what is what. Well, in come some distillers from Louisiana. They start taking blackstrap molasses, which can be used to make rum, distilling it and adding food coloring to it, and they were calling it bourbon. So imagine you go to a New Orleans liquor store or bar and you order a shot of bourbon, and it's essentially food colored, Bacardi. That's what they were doing. They were making food colored Bacardi and calling it bourbon. This became a major issue for the government because they were looking at this as the labeling was libelous to the Pure Food and Drug Act. But the defense was there was nothing in the Pure Food and Drug Act that said that bourbon was anything, right? So bourbon was not really anything special. It was just something that was trade, and people with honor would say like, okay, this is bourbon. It would legitimately be bourbon. Now these blenders, they weren't going out and blending something and necessarily calling it, a bourbon at this point. By this point they had their own blends and they had their own recipes and what have you, and they had their own brand. But these new people coming in were doing stuff like, food colored Bacardi. And so President Taft gets into office. He's seeing like these lawsuits come in. He's seeing all these inquiries come into the Department of Agriculture. And he spends several months studying bourbon, studying all types of whiskey, and he defines bourbon. He defines whiskey, Canadian whiskey. He basically is the forefather of American liquor labeling. He creates the most important set of guidelines for what is whiskey, what is bourbon. And, it was met with incredible opposition. The state of Texas refused to abide by it. Dr. Wiley, whom I mentioned, Pure Food and Drug Act, he took major issue with the fact that President Taft allowed for neutral spirit to come in, be mixed in with a whiskey and call it a blend. He was really upset about that. And that's the thing is, though, the labels that we have today, the very basic origin from blend of straights to bourbon, straight bourbon, it all goes back to President Taft. President Taft is the guy that puts this all into motion because he decided to move on, I guess at this point, this would have been 30, 40 years worth of discussion of what is whiskey. And that really closed the case on bourbon, and it closed the case on what is whiskey, and it basically flung away all the blackstrap molasses distillers adding food coloring. But timing is everything, right? So this is written in 1909. It's published in December, in like the late December 1909. It becomes into law in 1910, and over the next few years, you start having states discuss prohibition at a much, much higher level. And so instead of putting the focus on the Taft decision, everybody at this point was putting their focus on the prohibition folks. And Tennessee executes prohibition in 1909, taking out one of the big whiskey making states. You start seeing talks of World War I. We go into World War I. There's a prohibition during World War I, and then of course prohibition happens. And by the time prohibition ends in the mid 1930s, and everyone's starting to get back up in arms. I mean, the only body of real legislation that they had was the Taft decision, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and the Bottled and Bond Act. And so you were looking at President Taft dictating whiskey labeling, from the moment he penned that. And so that is why President Taft is, in my opinion, the greatest bourbon president of all time. For that, he is also in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. Only president in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame, by the way. And I think over the years he's had a bottle or two named after him. I think National Distillers did something. You know, every now and then he comes up in some kind of like tasting circles. But I wrote a big section about him in my book, Bourbon: The Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of American Whiskey. You know, one of the things about President Taft is he's kind of like known as the guy that got stuck in a bathtub. That's been refuted. Not some historians have later on came out and said, yeah, that didn't really happen. That was his opposition saying that. But it's still an interesting story to point out. I will say that he was large for his time, but if you look at him here, you know, that's not that big by today's standards. That's about normal. But if you want to read more about President Taft and other presidents, I wrote a lot about them in my book, Bourbon: The Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of American Whiskey. If you're into whiskey, I think getting into the history portion of it is so important. And you'll find links to my books in my description. Also, do you have a favorite whiskey president? Put it in the comments section. I would love to see your anecdote as to why a particular president is your favorite. That's going to do it for this little history segment. Thank you for tuning in. Be safe out there. And remember, vodka sucks unless it's being used for hand sanitizer. Cheers, y'all.